Thank you so much, Lauren. My name is Greg Busamra. I'm the Global Lead for SaaS Governance and Compliance Manager, our governance, risk, and compliance solution here at SaaS. It's embedded on the VIA platform, along with other governance solutions such as model risk management, with the AI governance, topics already embedded, as some of you may have seen in my colleagues Chris's and Kelly's other presentations held earlier today and yesterday. So nonetheless, as Lauren mentioned, I'm glad that you all made the pilgrimage over here to Vineyard Tower and look forward to sharing with you how we can use SaaS Governance and Compliance Manager to strengthen operational resilience in your organizations. So a little bit of a view into the agenda for today. We're going to start with product strategy. And here we're going to look at this product strategy not only from a governance, compliance, and manager perspective, but from our SaaS risk solutions perspective in general. We'll then move into the enterprise resilience framework. We're going to learn about how we can operationalize excellence in organizations through integration. And lastly, I have a nice little demonstration prepared for you, which is going to show us how our AI-enabled VIA platform is going to help us leverage the frameworks that are embedded into the solution and then make these otherwise very manual processes more automated, more transparent, and more trustworthy through agentic AI. So our product strategy focuses on three core principles: integration, accountability, and trust. Those of you who were in the sessions yesterday heard a lot about trust, a lot about accountability, and as we saw with our VIA platform visualizations, this platform allows the integration that we need to get the holistic approach to these various topics. As we unify our risk data across our enterprise, we can make better decisions and then also use AI models to create better forecasting, identify issues as they arise, and then act on various tasks using agentic AI agents for that purpose. With the GCM solution, we're also operating within a scalable framework. So we know as new regulations come about, new aspects of the organization need to be brought into solutions, and previously this has always presented an issue for our customers because they are used to working with one framework that then becomes static in a certain sense. With SaaS Governance and Compliance Manager, we're operating with a more adaptable platform that also has a scalable data model and powerful APIs so that we can bring data not only from within the framework, but also externally, and then make it available for all of those various tasks that I was discussing. The transparency that is provided by this framework then gives us end-to-end visibility and auditability across the entire operational risk and resilience lifecycle, as well as other topics like audit management, control testing, and other framework topics, which we'll get into here in a few slides. And lastly, we can gain efficiency with trusted AI to drive productivity, make the otherwise manual work for those end users all the more automated and all the more comfortable without sacrificing any level of governance. The reason that we focus on these four principles here is because we have growing regulatory requirements from around the world. For example, in Canada, we have the E21, as well as in the EU, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which applies not only to financial institutions, but those that are also critical to infrastructure, such as telecommunications, energy, et cetera. And then lastly, over in Australia, we have CPS 230 and CPS 234. But the operational resilience topic not only applies to those industries that are core to our geopolitical stability or our financial systems, but really any organization that is seeking to gain a competitive advantage by avoiding issues such as lost revenue or any sort of opportunity cost, regulatory or legal damages, et cetera. Before we jump into the enterprise resilience framework, I want to again highlight a slide that's been seen in a few other presentations so far here at Innovate, namely the journey of artificial intelligence and how it's driving value within SaaS solutions. So we have predictive AI, which allows us to leverage data patterns to forecast outcomes and make data-driven predictions, as well as generative AI, which can create new content, such as text, images, or code from learned patterns. And then lastly, agentic AI, which allows us to act on various tasks and pursue goals to make decisions and operate in support of a human user who can then close the information gap that Brian Harris talked about yesterday. So keeping these three pillars of artificial intelligence in mind, I challenge you as viewers today to think about how these various types of AI can be leveraged in your own respective operational resilience and operational risk frameworks. And I'll hopefully give you a few inspirations as to how we're doing that here at SAS today and how that can look for you in the future given our product roadmap. So looking at the enterprise resilience framework, this all boils down to overcoming operational disruptions in a dynamic risk environment. So we start by looking at the threat perspective. We see threats coming in from cyber attacks, as well as geopolitical risks, as we're looking at in the current conflict in the Middle East, as well as operational disruptions. These operational disruptions can be as near as, for example, someone dropping a laptop and it breaking and then having to wait a few days to complete their tasks otherwise. It can also be something as severe and as costly as a tsunami that floods a nuclear power plant, as we saw about a decade ago over in Fukushima. So having an approach to how these threats can be addressed, what risks are tied to those threats, and how we can then mitigate those risks and have action plans in place to then get back to our business as usual is what operational resilience is all about. The risks that arise from these various threats are manifold. For example, revenue loss, cost increases, as well as reputational damage. Yesterday, Brian was also talking about the role that social media plays and how technology increases influence. It multiplies our influence across the world. And so as companies face these threats, it becomes ever more critical how they respond to these threats and how they mitigate the risks that result, because if they don't do it in a fashion that is in the interest of their users, in the interest of their employees, they can face damages that are much higher than they have been in years past. Finally, the goals that they seek to realize and seek to gain from these are not only the general resilience. I know that I'm saying the word resilience frequently here, but it's all a matter of being able to take what comes at us from a otherwise uncontrollable environment, a risk environment, being able to address those risks in a compliant manner so that we're not creating any further issues as we attempt to maintain our business as usual, but instead focus on keeping in line with the guidelines imposed upon us by regulators, and then within those guidelines, then gaining a competitive advantage. This enterprise resilience life cycle can be depicted in a relatively simple cycle diagram, which begins with incident management, where we respond and learn from our disruptions. And as I go through these cycles, I also want to talk a little bit about how we can use AI in these respects. So thinking back to the previous slide, looking at the predictive AI, how can we learn from those disruptions? What have our incident histories shown us, and how can we then perhaps forecast incoming disruptions and be better prepared for them when they do in fact precipitate? We can then evaluate the risks and the controls that we use to mitigate those risks that arise from such incidents and could increase the likelihood of such incidents happening in the future. We look at our third parties that are involved, because not all risks are directly attributable to us, but can in fact be based in our supply chains. So whether we're a banking organization or insurance, or maybe manufacturing or some sort of utility, we're in a network of very many third parties, very many stakeholders involved, and having transparency across those stakeholder groups allows us to identify and mitigate those risks as they arise. Lastly, resilience testing, one of the more underrated aspects of operational resilience, but one that's very important, is that we need to validate our readiness and our accountability. So if we think outside of the virtual space with a real-world example, first responders are one of those groups that's always testing their ability to respond to a risk, to a threat, or a risk incident as it arises. Firefighters, police officers, military personnel, et cetera, spend much of their time not actively fighting the risks as they arrive, but preparing to fight those risks when they come up, such that when an emergency does present itself, that they're in the perfect position to respond and make sure that any effects of that incident are as minimal as possible. Bringing this level of practice and discipline into our organizations within a dedicated framework is paramount to making sure that we can respond to these operational disruptions as they arise and remain resilient through them. With that then, we can imagine how, again, AI can support us in these processes, whether it be through agentic tasks that are actively reviewing the control tests that we have in place, whether we have the forecasting models to highlight incidents as they may come down, or even generative AI that's helping us to crowdsource information across vast troves of data to then come up with better, more efficient ways of addressing risks as they arise. So I've broken down the life cycle from the previous slide into its component parts. Each of these can be represented as a disk or an entity within an enterprise resilience framework. And these pertain to risks themselves, the controls that mitigate them, incidents that arise from these risks, as well as the effects that those incidents bear, as well as policies that tell us how we should, from a normative perspective, address such a risk environment, as well as indicators that show us how we're performing when it comes to the actual response to those risk incidents. We can assess our risks and the controls. We can audit our ability to follow policy and react appropriately to incidents. And again, the control tests, as mentioned before, exercise and remain strong for any arising incident that may come. But we have to do all of this within the uncertain regulatory environment. Here I've got it shown twice, because a regulatory environment, as evidenced in light gray, may evolve, for example, for third parties. On the other hand, as evidenced in dark gray, we have a different regulatory environment that may then apply to IT risk, for example. So within an organization, everybody is subject to regulatory compliance. They want to maintain it. But one silo of the organization may be focusing on regulatory compliance in their field. Another silo in the organization is looking at it from a different side. They may have two entirely independent systems to address this, two entirely independent frameworks. And so in the event that an incident, for example, arising from the light gray area comes to play, it's going to involve data from light gray and teams from light gray and stakeholders from light gray. That's all fine as long as we're operating within that silo. However, if from dark gray we come to some sort of regulatory development or an incident involving those regulations, we have different data, different stakeholders, and different teams. All of this then leads to isolated processes, fragmented ownership, and data quality can suffer as a result. Now, organizations try to bring all this together through various processes, usually in dedicated systems, SharePoint drives, mail chains, et cetera. And as you can see, without an integrated system to approach this, it gives us a bit of a headache. Does this look familiar to anybody? Yeah, I thought so. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who might catch hives from this slide, so we'll try not to spend too much time looking at it. And what we're looking at here is really just the attempt to create transparency, accountability, and actionability within an organization. But without an integrated governance solution, we're going to get lost in chaos. And this here is also just looking at the communicative aspect of such management. If I were to then think about how we can bring in AI or other sorts of modeling into the picture, we would add another dimension to this slide, which would then bring us all the way to the door. So with that, just focusing on the communication aspects in a two-dimensional view, we're already lost. Adding any sort of analytical layer to that is going to make it effectively impossible. So how do we address this? We move into SaaS Viya. And unfortunately, I see that there should be a blue track here that will look nicer, but for whatever reason, it's not rendering. At least not on this projector. I see it on the diagram over there. Nonetheless, so we can use the SaaS Viya platform to strengthen our governance and integrate our risk and compliance procedures into a single management solution on a framework or on a platform that offers us the trustworthy AI, data governance, analytics, and visualization that you've seen in various other sessions so far here at Innovate. So what this slide is showing is that on the Viya platform, we bring the strength that SaaS has been offering for the last 50 years and is going to bring for days to come. especially when it comes to trustworthy AI. All of the agents that we see today, all of the models that we're viewing are governable within the VIA framework. So while they're not necessarily inherent to the solutions themselves, they're building off of the framework and the foundation that VIA provides. And that's what gives us strength as SAS with our solutions, is that we can feed off of that and we can bring that transparency and governability into a solution that otherwise would have to outsource that governability to some other external system. On the VIA platform then, we see the Governance and Compliance Manager solution, which is used for enterprise governance, resilience, and compliance purposes. And then drilling down further into other use cases, we have, for example, model risk management and AI governance, which my colleagues have shown in other sessions this week. What is particularly valuable, though, on this solution breakdown is that various aspects of, for example, Governance and Compliance Manager drill across the solution framework thanks to the common VIA platform and the shared data models, such that we can integrate across them. So when leveraging all of our solutions, and not only those depicted here on this slide, but many more on the VIA platform, which we'll see in the demo, as represented here by the light gray disk, we're then able to feed off of all of our various data that stands for our review. Then, of course, leverage AI, be it predictive AI, generative AI, or agentic AI, to make our lives easier in an otherwise headache-inducing framework environment. Again, our key focus here is that we're trying to ensure holistic enterprise governance across these varied tasks. I'll give you a demonstration of how this appears in our solution by first showing our VIA landing page, and I'll stop the demo at appropriate positions so we can get a better view of what we see. So here within our VIA landing page, we already see that we not only have our Governance and Compliance Manager here at the bottom, alongside Model Risk Management. Those are the two solutions that I showed in the previous slide. But we also have our other VIA solutions also directly available. So asset and liability management, funds transfer pricing, expected credit loss and stress testing, risk modeling, all the way up to insurance capital management, and integrated regulatory reporting, et cetera. So from within one UI, we have visibility across all of our solutions on the platform, and that's going to allow us to then tap into the information maintained there and make all communication with those respective stakeholders as needed possible, where we would otherwise be lost in a sea of emails, shared documents, et cetera. So as we scroll down into the solution, we enter our landing page here, which has a list of available tasks. The solution itself, as I mentioned, is entirely scalable and configurable for your needs. So if there are other customer desires in terms of what a homepage, how a homepage should be rendered, that of course can be implemented per the customer requirements. Again, on the left-hand side of the screen, we see all of the available solutions that the permissioned user can access. So if I'm a very high-ranking executive, I will have the ability to see all of my solutions that are pertinent to my daily business. If I'm only working in the governance and compliance management sphere, maybe raising risk categories or the mitigating controls, then I would only see my governance and compliance manager solution. So as we move through the solution itself then, we can pull up our risk dashboard, or governance and compliance dashboard, excuse me. And this then gives us a summary overview of all the data stored within the solution itself. We have, for example, our findings dashboard, which is filterable based on status, owner, and severity. And then based on the visualizations, we can also drill down into what specific findings are, for example, 30 days past due, et cetera. And again here, based on the visual analytics reporting platform, we can adjust these reports to show the information that we require. So here is an example. Again, we have our findings dashboard, actions plans, controls, risks, and incidents. And then in the next section of our demo, we will focus on incident management and see how agentic AI can support us here using our VIA Copilot. So again, we're in the SaaS Governance and Compliance Manager solution. I've opened up the Incidents tab, and then here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the VIA Copilot that you've already had the opportunity to witness from other demos. Now, please note that here what we're seeing is the beta version. So this is the initial implementation of VIA Copilot. There are no GCM-specific tasks deployed at this point in time, so we're really only focusing on the Copilot and LLM. But nonetheless, we see that we have initial functionality and our ability to summarize data, and we'll go into some further use cases once the agent then catches up with us and gives us our overview of the current incidents. So here we see that we've created a summary table. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have our static table of incidents. And again, based on our user permissions, we would see only those that are within our scope of operation. So if I'm, for example, looking at incidents that only happen, or I'm only allowed to see incidents that happen in Germany, only those will be shown to me. If I'm another user, then who might only be able to see incidents that are currently under investigation and not those that have been completed, the Copilot can then allow us to talk to our data and see incidents that are under investigation. The use case then that I'm going to pursue here, as you'll see as the Copilot then gives us our responses, is that we can then dive into a given incident, and then from that incident we can see what specifically happened, what kind of effects may arise from that incident, how we can mitigate such effects in the future, and apply any gap analyses. So here we see that the Copilot now is filtering the table that it previously provided. And then the next query, for example, applies to the specific power outage that we saw at the Frankfurt data center. So here now, all of the further queries that are going to be applied are going to look with an extra focus to the incident that we're currently viewing. And again, the incident itself underlies a workflow. We have various classification data involved such that those who aren't permissioned to view this incident, of course, won't. I don't know if anybody was in the MRM session earlier today in the Innovation Hub, but the visualization, for example, of linked objects, be they linked risks, linked effects, any downstream effects caused by an incident, and any controlling measures, again, all can be rendered visually here with our VIA-based platform and the solutions nested within it. So here we can apply summarization and get a clear text understanding of what happened in this specific incident. And then we can ask what effects could result from this incident. We then receive a bulleted list of potential incidents and then can also query our documentation. So frequently, users who are using a system like this don't always log onto the system. They're not spending all day within it. And instead of having to review PowerPoint documentation stored in some shared drive, they can simply ask the solution itself how they're meant to operate with it and receive that information directly. They receive then step-by-step guides on how the effects, for example, in this use case, can be documented. And then here, based on the suggestions provided, they can provide a query that then asks how they can create an effect for remediation and recovery costs for the power outage incident. They receive the step-by-step instructions on how this task is to be completed in GCM. And just for sort of a future forward look at what we have in our product roadmap, as we saw in other aspects or in other demonstrations provided here at Innovate, we can program we can program AI agents who then can automatically complete these tasks that we're currently completing here with copy and paste based on the responses provided by the LLM. So again, as shown here, what we're seeing is in fact a manual copy effort from the feedback from the LLM, but this, using the technology that is embedded within the Viya platform and the Viya Copilot, we can automate this with appropriate agents moving forward. So here the demo just shows the completion of this effect as it's linked to the incident at hand. We also have documentation capability, so any sort of attachments that need to be added, links to external sites, as well as comments, all are easily capturable within the solution. And then we can move back to our incident, and here we're asking why this incident happened. We get a breakdown of what specifically contributed to this incident arising, and then we can also ask which of our controls could have helped avoid this incident. So the Copilot then goes in and looks within the system, what were the mitigating controls that we've got in our data model? What do we have in action currently that mitigate the risks of power outage, for example? We have a lot of controls in our system currently, so that's why the agent is taking a little bit of time to respond. So it's indexing, and then we'll provide feedback on what controls we could have applied, and then I didn't include it in this demo for time purposes, but we could then, for example, have the agent go about a control assessment as applied to the risks of power outage. So here we see the overview of the various controls that are in our system that could have contributed to avoiding this incident. We can then identify what the controls are that we have not yet implemented, so apply a gap analysis to our framework and see what we don't have in the system that we could also implement. And here we can see that the Copilot then can also give us help either documenting the controls or linking them to the risk framework. This final query is asking which of the controls listed above are not already implemented within the system. And based on our current GCM controls, we receive a table of recommended controls for avoiding remediation and recovery costs from power outages that we don't already have in the system. So here we receive a nice tabular overview. I'll let the query complete. So here, in this gap analysis use case, we get a nice overview of recommended controls, how to avoid a power outage at a data center, be it from an environmental catastrophe, an act of domestic terrorism, or just simply maybe a bird or squirrel got into some wires. So we can implement, for example, automated monitoring and alerting systems. We can have power backup systems such as generator, redundant data center operations, and operate more in the cloud, as well as staff contingency planning, incident response, et cetera. We see here the extent to which these controls are already implemented in GCM. The service level agreement, for example, is already implemented based on our third-party and internal provider SLA review control, and we have the control IDs that we can reference there, as well as other topics such as asset insurance for hardware losses. So this concludes the demo in this regard, but what we can think about moving forward in terms of a roadmap expectations, is that in the same way that we saw agentic AI, for example, completing model documentation or model assessment based on existing documentation, we can also expect agentic AI within the SaaS Viya platform to support our end users in bringing the information that we gather from such gap analyses or risk control self-assessments into the system automatically through then the automated creation of such controls within the framework. So here, again, I show that what we're seeing in the Copilot based on the beta implementation is the response from the LLM as it currently stands. Of course, I would then have to create each of these manually, but we can imagine that in the near future, once we have our agentic AI programmed for the GCM solution specifically, in the same way that we saw it support model assessment, we can also expect it to support us here in, for example, gap analysis closure. I will let the video run till the end, but I believe that's the last of it. And yes, video's over. So I'm happy to open the floor for any questions you may have. I hope that you enjoyed the demo. I know that there's a lot to digest, but if there's anything specifically you'd like to see, then I'm happy. I see we have about 15 minutes left. So yeah, I'd be eager to start the conversation with you. No questions? Otherwise, I'll be at the SAS Financial Services booth back at the Innovation Hub later. In case anybody has a bit of stage fright and wants to talk in a more intimate setting, you can find me there too. All right, thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate it.